Tyler Evans wasn't expecting trouble. After 3 days away helping his brother with a barn roof repair, he looked forward to nothing more than a quiet evening, a grilled steak, and maybe some old Western reruns. But as he turned the final curve leading toward his land, his tires rolled to a stop on their own. He didn't hit the brakes. His foot hovered in disbelief. A jagged line of orange traffic cones blocked his driveway, stretching from the far ditch to the edge of his stone mailbox. Beyond them, metal barricades were propped up like they'd been dropped from the back of a county truck. One even leaned awkwardly against a rusted fence post, its corner scraping Tyler's cedar tree. At first he thought there'd been an accident, maybe a sinkhole, but there were no workers, no signs of soil erosion, nothing that looked like damage, just the cold stillness of an ordinary afternoon disrupted by something petty and wrong. He parked in the gravel shoulder and walked up, his boots crunching over pebbles. A laminated sheet, zip-tied to the mailbox, flapped in the wind. The red lettering was meant to be intimidating. Notice of access suspension, property in violation of community. Appearance codes. Vehicle access revoked pending compliance resolution with Willow Heights Homeowners Association. Tyler stared at it without blinking. He didn't live in Willow Heights. He didn't pay their dues, didn't attend their meetings, and never received so much as a flyer. His property stood at the edge of the development half a mile from the nearest cul-de-sac and was fenced off years before those houses were even built. He pulled the sign off without a word and walked the length of the cones. They weren't even weighted properly. Most could be kicked aside by a teenager on a bicycle. Whoever put them there had done so quickly, maybe without full authority. Across the road, a curtain twitched. A silver-haired woman holding a cup of tea watched him from her window. She ducked when their eyes met. Farther down, a man in cargo shorts leaned on his garage railing, arms crossed, pretending to scroll his phone. A small dog barked behind a chain-link fence. Tyler didn't say a word to any of them. Instead, he stepped back over the barrier and drove through the shoulder, clipping the grass with his tires as he curved into his own gravel driveway. It wasn't ideal, but it got him home. As his truck pulled up beside the barn, he sat still for a moment, letting the engine idle low. A thin smile crept onto his face, the kind that said he wasn't mad, just calculating. Inside his home, a small metal file box sat under the side table. He pulled it out, brushing off dust. Inside were folded deeds, land surveys, and maps from the county office. Yellowed corners, handwritten margins. He flipped to a folder marked Grandad -1979. There it was. The road outside, the one now blocked by cones and guarded by HOA paper threats, was part of the original land deed. It had never been transferred. It wasn't public. It wasn't HOA maintained. It wasn't even included in their zoning map. It was his. He held the paper in one hand, already feeling the weight of the coming days. They thought they could bully him off his own access. They hadn't looked close enough. They didn't know what the road truly meant or who it really belonged to. Tyler went to the window, and looked out toward the cones. This wasn't over. It hadn't even started yet. By morning, the cones were still there. A fresh notice had been stapled to the cedar post, thicker this time, printed on glossy letterhead with legal-sounding language. The seal of the Willow Heights Homeowners Association sat in the corner, as if it had any weight beyond the paper it was printed on. Tyler didn't touch it. He'd already seen enough. Instead, he walked the edge of the driveway with a notepad in one hand and a measuring wheel in the other. He counted every foot from the start of the road curve to the first line of his fencing. A few neighbors passed in their cars, slowing just a bit, trying not to look like they were staring. One waved with hesitation. Tyler didn't wave back. Inside, he laid the fresh notes beside the old survey map from 1979. The boundaries hadn't shifted. If anything, they'd only been paved over with false assumptions. The road, from the county turnoff to the far utility easement, fell entirely on his deeded property. The HOA must have believed it was public because the county hadn't maintained it in years, but they never checked the title. He made a few phone calls, first to the county clerk's office, confirming the road's status, then to a private title specialist in town, someone who'd helped him once before during a dispute over water rights. She remembered him and promised to review the filings by evening, while the documents were being checked. Tyler walked down to the barn. He passed the oak tree where his grandfather used to sit with a pipe and a jar of lemonade, telling stories about cattle drives that had long faded into memory. This land had stayed in their family for 3 generations. It had never been part of anyone else's rules. Not the cities, not the developers. Certainly not a board of retirees trying to enforce lawn height. He sat on the old workbench and pulled out a pen. On a clean sheet of paper, he drafted the first letter. Not aggressive, not hostile, just factual. He cited the recorded deed number, the boundary lines, the year of land acquisition. He stated that any further interference would be treated as trespassing and obstruction of access. He enclosed a copy of the survey map, folded neatly, and placed it in an envelope. He addressed it directly to the HOA president. By sunset, he drove the envelope to the HOA office himself. It was just a rented room in a strip mall between a dry cleaner and a yoga studio. The blinds were down, the lights off. A stack of newsletters sat beside the door, some half blown across the sidewalk. He slipped the envelope under the door and walked away without looking back. When he returned home, he found a man photographing his truck from across the street. The man wore a reflective vest and held a clipboard. He didn't introduce himself, didn't wave, just jotted something down and walked toward the coal-d-sack. Tyler smiled, just faintly. He went back inside and opened his laptop. He began scanning old planning commission minutes documents no one had probably looked at in years. Hidden within the files was a zoning map from before Willow Heights existed. The road had been a ranch trail then. It hadn't changed since, except for the asphalt. What they paved, they assumed they owned. That assumption was about to cost them. He turned off the light, sat by the window, and watched the last streak of daylight fade beyond the cones. They were still standing, but they wouldn't be for long. The third morning arrived with a new surprise dot where the cones had been. A temporary fence now stood thin metal posts driven into the gravel, strung with plastic mesh, sagging between each section like a hurried afterthought. A HOA tag fluttered near the center, warning that trespassing onto the restricted zone could result in legal consequences. Someone had even tied a cheap plastic chain across the entry gap, held shut with a bicycle lock. Tyler didn't approach it right away. He stood at the edge of his porch, coffee in hand, and looked out with the stillness of someone calculating his next 5 moves before making the first one. A few cars rolled by behind the fence, slowing down just enough to catch a glimpse. A couple on bicycles pedaled past, whispering between themselves. One of them pointed toward Tyler's barn before quickly lowering her hand when she realized he was watching. He spotted movement near the fence line. A man with a ball cap and clipboard appeared to be measuring something, using a long tape reel, and writing on a form with practiced strokes. The man avoided eye contact, but Tyler noticed the HOA emblem on his jacket. Tyler didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The pressure was building, and the board didn't even realize how close they were to touching a live wire. Back inside, the phone rang. It was the title specialist. She'd finished reviewing the documents. The road is private, she confirmed. It was never deeded to the city or the HOA. You're the only listed owner. They have no legal access without an agreement. Tyler thanked her and hung up. He scanned a copy of the official record and added it to a digital folder he'd been building for days. Legal boundaries, survey records, old zoning maps. He'd even found a county engineering drawing that labeled the road as non-dedicated private easement Evans Ranch Tract. It was all there, hiding in plain sight. Later that afternoon, he watched from the shadows of his porch as the same man returned with 2 others. One held a camera. They took photos not just of the fence but of Tyler's barn, mailbox, even the rusted tractor he kept under a lean-to. They never set foot on his property, but they didn't need to. We're collecting fuel for the fire. Tyler reached for his phone and reviewed the security footage. Every movement outside the fence was recorded. The placement of the barriers, the property line, the survey markers, it was all being documented. He emailed a copy of the footage to his attorney, adding a brief note. They've escalated. Time. To respond just before sundown, he placed a second envelope in the outgoing mail. This one was addressed to every member of the HOA board, with copies of the land ownership documents included. The cover letter was brief, but the final sentence stood out like a bell in a church tower. You have blocked a road you do not own. You have restricted access to a driveway built on private land. You have 48 hours to remove the obstructions, or access to the road will be terminated. As dusk settled in, Tyler locked his gate and walked the fence line one last time. The plastic mesh rippled in the evening wind. It wasn't strong, it wasn't legal, and it wasn't going to last. From a living room across the street, someone watched him and lowered the blinds. The game had shifted. The next move wouldn't be measured in notices or photos. It would be measured in silence. And then, in impact, morning came colder than usual, with a layer of dew clinging to the plastic fence like a warning. Tyler stepped outside, his boots damp, from the grass, and looked toward the barricade. Nothing had changed. The mesh sagged, the cones lay scattered at the edge, and the lock on the chain still held tight. The 48-hour clock had started. Instead of approaching the fence, Tyler crossed the yard toward his mailbox. Inside was a fat envelope with Willow Heights Homeowners Association printed neatly across the top. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. The contents would be vague legal references, page-long clauses, and appeals to compliance authority. None of it would matter. He placed the envelope on his workbench and returned inside. By midday, the neighborhood app buzzed with activity. Someone had posted that a resident was threatening to shut down the only road into the community. Others chimed in with speculations, most incorrect. One claimed Tyler was planning to build a shed across the road. Another said he was trying to sell the land to a developer. Some called for calm, while others demanded board action. The board didn't respond, not publicly. That silence stirred more trouble than any rumor. Tyler's attorney had already drafted a formal cessation. The document was short and precise. It declared the HOA had no legal claim over the road. It detailed the trespassing committed by blocking private access. And it stated clearly, continued obstruction would result in permanent closure of the road to all non-authorized traffic. The warning was not a bluff. Tyler had options. He could install a gate, he could trench the road, he could lease access under private terms. Every legal avenue favored him and the board had yet to consult their own lawyers. Later that afternoon, a city utility truck pulled up just outside the fence. 2 workers walked over to inspect a cable junction near Tyler's fence. They nodded, politely but said little. Tyler observed from a distance. The truck wasn't from the county. It had been called in by someone trying to establish who owned what underground. Likely a last-minute effort to challenge Tyler's authority over the road. But it was too late for that. He walked back to his barn and opened a weathered metal cabinet. Inside was a stack of road markers, remnants from when his grandfather had sectioned off grazing routes. Tyler sorted through them, choosing 5 with reflectors and faded paint. He wiped them clean and carried them to the edge of his property. By dusk, 5 small white flags stood at measured intervals across the asphalt. Each one marked a property boundary listed in the deed. Each one served as a silent warning dot at the edge of his land. Tyler posted a laminated sign on a wooden stake. It read simply, "Private property. No unauthorized vehicle access without written permission." He hammered the stake deep into the gravel and stepped back. Inside their homes, people peeked from behind blinds and curtains. Some took photos through windows. One man walked by pretending to check his mailbox. Twice in the same hour. The silence was turning into pressure. The HOA had overplayed their hand. They'd gone from passive-aggressive letters to physical interference. Unaware they were fencing off land they didn't control. They had no plan, just routine and assumption. And Tyler wasn't bluffing. The deadline would arrive soon. They'd chosen the wrong battle, on the wrong road, with the wrong man. At sunrise, the road changed. Tyler had waited precisely 48 hours from the time he delivered the final notice. As daylight broke, a small crew arrived in silence. 2 trucks, 1 backhoe, a utility van parked near the turnoff. None of the workers wore uniforms. They were contractors Tyler had used before, quiet, fast, and loyal to the letter. They started by laying cones at both ends of the stretch leading into the Willow Heights neighborhood. Not HOA cones, but Tyler's. Bright yellow, freshly painted, marked with the phrase, "Private easement access under restriction." Then came the trench dot. It wasn't deep just enough to prevent through traffic. A 6-inch cut, running across the pavement, filled loosely with gravel and flagged with reflective tape. It ran exactly along the property line. Per the deed, not an inch over, left a gap just wide enough for pedestrians or bicycles. Emergency vehicles could still get through if they tried, but sedans and SUVs, they would scrape their undersides trying by the time neighbors noticed. The work was nearly done. Tyler stood beside the trench with folded arms as the HOA president marched down the sidewalk, red-faced, flanked by 2 board members. None of them crossed the trench. They stood at its edge, exchanging angry glances as if expecting Tyler to offer an explanation. He didn't. "Mr. Evans," the president began, voice raised to carry across the gap. "This action is unlawful and reckless. You're putting the entire community at risk. Children ride their bikes here. What if there's an emergency?" Tyler held up a document without stepping forward. "Your board was warned? Twice. This is private land. That fence," he gestured toward the plastic mesh behind them, "was a violation. I have no further interest in speaking without legal counsel present." They hesitated. The younger board member took a step forward but was stopped by the older man. They backed off. Within the hour, the neighborhood's group chat exploded. Cars lined up at the edge of the trench. Some tried to reverse, others inched forward, unsure whether to risk it. One driver attempted to cross and bottomed out with a sharp clang. Children missed the morning bus. Parents called in late to work. Delivery trucks turned around in confusion. Lawn crews paced up and down the sidewalk, looking for new access. By late afternoon, residents had begun gathering near the barricade. Some were angry, others simply confused. Tyler watched from his porch but said nothing. He didn't need to justify himself anymore. The burden had shifted. A single page of the land deed now hung on a bulletin board near the fence, laminated and underlined. Below it, a printed message from Tyler. "Road access restricted under legal ownership. For negotiated entry, contact the private landholder directly." People didn't know what to make of it. Was he serious? Was this permanent? In a house 2 streets over, a young mother held her child and stared at the trench from her porch. She had no idea how to get groceries that afternoon. Her neighbor came by to ask if she wanted to carpool. Others began discussing side exits and old hiking paths behind the development that might loop out to the next street. Whispers of a meeting began. Not a formal board session, just a neighborhood gathering. Some residents had started to question the board's choices. Why hadn't they confirmed the property boundaries? Why had they gone after someone who never signed the HOA agreement? Why had they provoked instead of negotiated? The road wasn't just blocked. Something else had shifted. People weren't looking at Tyler like a problem anymore. They were starting to look at the board. The trench had become more than a barrier. It was a symbol, quiet, unmoving, and impossible to ignore. What began as whispers turned into steady voices. On every corner of Willow Heights, neighbors gathered in clusters. Lawn chairs appeared on sidewalks. Parents talked while their children sat on curbs. backpacks dangling off one shoulder, wondering why the bus never came anymore. No one from the board spoke publicly. A small note was posted near the mail kiosk, stamped with the HOA seal. It claimed that active legal steps were being taken, and the matter was under review by Association Council. But no letterhead, no names, just vague language meant to calm a growing unrest. It didn't work. Inside their homes, residents were beginning to read Tyler's deed, printed and laminated, had been copied and shared across group chats. Someone had scanned it and posted it to the neighborhood app. It was simple, really lines, numbers, dates. But those lines said one thing louder than any legal threat. The road wasn't theirs. People didn't blame Tyler anymore, not even close. They blamed the board. A longtime resident named Fred, who'd kept to himself for years, spoke up for the first time during an impromptu sidewalk meeting. He said he remembered the land when it was still ranch property, long before the HOA formed. Another neighbor confirmed that Tyler's grandfather used to lease the land to hunters and loggers. Someone else pulled up archived property tax records showing Tyler's family had paid maintenance fees on the road for decades. The board's credibility cracked that night. The next morning, the HOA president's car didn't leave her driveway. The plastic fence was quietly removed before noon. One board member was seen pacing in front of the neighborhood park, making phone calls, voice rising in frustration. Another avoided the main road entirely, taking a long detour through a service alley to get to work. Still, they didn't speak to Tyler. And Tyler didn't speak to them. Instead, he walked the edge of the trench again, checking the gravel, fill, and reflector placement. The trench was stable, legal, and symbolic. He wasn't blocking emergency access. He wasn't violating any ordinance. He was simply enforcing what the law had always allowed him to do. His phone buzzed a message from his lawyer. It was short. They've contacted council, trying to negotiate quietly. He expected as much. The HOA wasn't afraid of him anymore. They were afraid of their own residents. By late afternoon, a delegation arrived not from the board, but from the neighborhood. 3 residents walked up to the trench. They didn't carry papers, no clipboards, no threats, no phones recording, just tired eyes and questions. The man in the center stepped forward. We'd like to talk, not about blame, about fixing this without the board. Tyler studied their faces. One of them was the woman with the child. Another was the man who had watched from behind his garage railing that first day. He nodded once and stepped forward. They spoke for an hour at the edge of the road. No shouting, no formalities. Just clear questions and calm answers. They wanted to know what he wanted. He told them, respect for boundaries, written access terms, no false claims. The woman asked if he would consider a lease arrangement. He said he'd consider anything written with honesty. As dusk fell, the streetlights flickered on. The trench remained, but something else had shifted. For the first time, people weren't just staring from behind windows. They were standing in the open, speaking, listening. The board had vanished from sight. The community was starting to lead itself. The meeting happened on a Thursday evening. Not in a boardroom, not under HOA control, but on Tyler's land, just beyond the trench. Beneath the white oak tree where his grandfather once sat, folding chairs were arranged in a rough semicircle. Someone had brought lemonade. Someone else printed copies of the deed. Neighbors who had never spoken before now exchanged nods and greetings. What began as tension had transformed into quiet cooperation. The HOA board wasn't invited. Not one of them showed up. Tyler didn't stand at the center or speak first. He waited. Let others begin. The man from 2 streets over, Richard, spoke about the lack of transparency. The young mother explained how the blocked road had made her miss work. Another woman described the growing fear that if the board didn't step aside, things would only get worse. Tyler listened. When the circle grew quiet, he stepped forward. He held nothing in his hands, no papers, no threats, just the same calm that had carried him through each day of silence and surveillance. I never wanted a fight, he said. All I asked for was to be left alone. When they put up cones and fences, I warned them. Twice they didn't listen. No one interrupted. I'm not interested in power over this road, but I won't give it up either. I've paid taxes on it, maintained it, and until now, respected every car that passed over it. The crowd stayed quiet, not from fear, but from attention. I'll make you this offer, he continued. You draft a new agreement. Not through the HOA, a neutral group, formed by residents. You give me your terms, and I'll give you mine. I'll lease access, long-term, with conditions. No more harassment. No more notices, no trespassing without permission. You respect my boundary. I guarantee the road stays open. A murmur passed. Through the chairs, heads nodded. A few looked visibly relieved. And the HOA, someone asked. Tyler paused, then shrugged. They're irrelevant if you make them irrelevant. That was the moment the real fracture occurred. The next day a petition began. Printed sheets passed house to house, one to dissolve the HOA entirely, another to form a voluntary neighborhood association, open, elected, and without legal enforcement powers. Just neighbors, deciding together. By sundown, over 60 signatures had been collected at the same time. The HOA board sent out a final letter. It arrived by email and paper both. It was defensive, urgent, and full of language about community, safety, and retaining order. But it lacked something essential: control. Their message had come too late. Their silence during the crisis had been louder than any apology. Now, 2 board members resigned that week. The third stopped responding altogether. By Saturday, Tyler received a knock at his gate. Richard stood there with a folder in his hand. Inside was a draft agreement, fair, respectful, and reviewed by an independent attorney. It acknowledged Tyler's property rights, granted access to residents under defined terms, and placed maintenance of the road under shared responsibility. Tyler read it slowly, standing in the sunlight with the wind brushing through the oak leaves. Overhead, "I'll sign it," he said. 3 days later, the trench was filled, not erased but smoothed into the earth. Its presence remembered but no longer in the way. A wooden post was planted beside it, and on it, a modest sign was hung. Road use granted by the landholder. Access is a privilege earned by respect, and, just like that, the gate that once separated became a reminder of unity. The boardroom was empty, but the neighborhood had finally come alive. Weeks passed, but the trench wasn't forgotten. Even as it was filled in and repaved, residents remembered how quickly the ground beneath them could shift. What had once felt stable, a quiet street, a harmless association, a routine life had cracked open to reveal something different beneath. The road wasn't just a path anymore. It had become a lesson. The old board never met again. No farewell letters, no apology, just absence. Their office, once filled with paper notices and rubber stamps, was emptied quietly over a weekend. A new keyholder took over Richard. He wasn't elected, just trusted. The residents didn't want control anymore. They wanted cooperation. The HOA was officially dissolved 2 months later, with enough signatures to meet the threshold. Tyler didn't attend the vote. He didn't need to. The outcome was already clear. On his land, things stayed much the same. The gate remained open, but not unguarded. A new sign replaced the old warning. This one carved from oak, hand-painted by a neighbor who ran a woodworking shop out of his garage. It read, "Private road, shared by agreement. Trust earns passage." People respected it, not because of fines, not because of bylaws, because of what it meant now. Children started biking down the street again, not hurried or anxious, but free. Neighbors who once nodded from porches began stopping to talk. One even brought Tyler a pie. Another left a thank you card on his gate, unsigned, but with a note inside. "I didn't know what was real until I saw who stood still when everything else panicked." Tyler didn't display it. He didn't mention it, but he kept it in the drawer beside the land deed. The community changed in small ways after that. No one told anyone what color their curtains could be, or how long their truck could sit in the driveway. But gardens bloomed, porches were swept, and streets stayed clean. Not because someone enforced it, but because people finally felt like they belonged to something that didn't demand, only included. One evening, Tyler sat under the oak tree where it had all begun. The sun was setting low over the rooftops, casting long shadows across the road. He could still hear the echo of the arguments, the scrape of cones, the clink of a fence being forced into gravel. But he also heard laughter now, kids playing too. Houses down, a dog barking at nothing in particular. Quiet music drifting from a backyard cookout. Life had returned, not because it had been restored, but because it had been rebuilt. Then came the twist. A letter arrived in Tyler's mailbox, not from a resident, not from a neighbor. It was from a real estate development company. They had discovered the ownership of the road and were offering to buy an easement not just for Willow Heights, but to run fiber optic cable through it for a nearby expansion. The amount offered was generous. Too generous for what they needed. Tyler read it twice. Then, slowly, he tore it in half and fed the pieces into the fireplace. Some things were meant to remain untouched, not for profit, not for leverage, but for peace. The road would stay what it was, a quiet ribbon of asphalt over old soil, shared by those who knew what it cost to protect it. As the last light disappeared beyond the trees, Tyler leaned back in his chair. He didn't win by shouting. He didn't fight by force. He just stood where he always hadn't. Let the road speak for itself.